what we'll do now is we'll go to a panel discussion. So we've got representatives from each of the consulting groups. So I'd ask Deborah, Jason, Jeff, Richard, John, and Dean to come up here, and they can line themselves up in the front. And the panel discussion will be moderated by Rick Rogerson. And Rick has informed me that he's got a couple of questions for the panel himself. So we've got a fair cross-section of JORC ASX and consulting groups. So thank you very much, Rick, and I'm sure we'll have some heated discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a big group. It's hard to sort of turn that far. Look, the way we thought we'd do this is begin with, frankly, a group of Dorothy Dixes to the panel, particularly focusing on some of the areas that the panel already knows cause some issues. We'll do this until, or give you an opportunity to think up any questions that haven't already been addressed. And I'm sure there must be. So we'll give you, I don't know, this session is, about an hour long, I think. So probably about half an hour, maybe 20, 25 minutes. It depends on how many questions you want to are not already addressed or haven't been addressed in the presentations we've already heard this afternoon. And then when I do call for questions, I want people to move to one of these microphones. Otherwise, the audio-visual guys over there won't pick up what the question was. Okay. Well, to kick things off a little bit, I've got a general question. I guess it could be anyone that answers this one, and that's who should CPs contact if they do need advice, and what best practice information is available out there. And I could ask any number of people sitting out the front.
I don't mind going first.
Yeah, okay. Nothing like consultants, and particularly they're always pretty quick off the mark.
Okay.
CSA gets the first go.
Yeah, and probably the easiest question too. But look, I guess contact JORC itself. There's information available on the website, and then you can contact any of the representatives you know that are on JORC or on the bodies which belong to JORC, such as AIG and AusIMM, your local member. And then also speak to your peers, and I would say that all of us here would be happy to be contacted as well.
For a fee?
Well, no.
Oh, okay.
Not initially, anyhow. But look, there's also Monograph 30, which is coming out, which will be a great source, and Monograph 23, which has been out before. So there's plenty of material available.
How far away is Monograph 30, by the way?
April, says Jackie.
April, okay. All right. Anything to add to that list? I think it's fairly good. I guess to me, been chairing the ARG Complaints Committee for a long time, the elephant really in the room is exploration targets. And I have a number of issues with these. I see announcements with lots of neurology, and there's been some good ones lately in the Albany Fraser for very good reasons. The use of, I guess, exploration target in a noun sense versus we are targeting in a verb sense, which I think is probably the way it started and gradually ended up as a noun. The other ones I've seen lately, exploration targets that sort of wrap themselves around an inferred resource or even an indicated resource, and it's very unclear to me where one begins and the other one, or one ends and the other one begins. I know that for the 2004 code, the issue of exploration targets split the JORC itself in terms of some were for and some were against, but it has been expressed to me today. One prominent member of JORC actually said the genie's out of the bottle at this stage, and we've probably got exploration targets whether we like them or not. My question, I guess, generally to the panel is how can we end up, I guess, constraining an exploration target without the code getting larger and larger and larger around exploration targets? And it already has gone through an expansion. I can see it going even further. How do we limit that expansion of text and try and prevent, I think, the movement away from principles associated with JORC and without putting too fine a point on it, get the lawyers involved too much with exploration targets? And I say this looking at a particular group of people sitting in front of me here. But how can we limit this growth of regulation almost around an exploration target? Not you, someone else. Look at them. Interesting.
Yeah, look, I'll have a go. And I guess I come from it from a VALMIN point of view. I'm on the VALMIN committee, and I've had numerous discussion with aforementioned lawyers about these things. From the valuation sense, I'd quite like to see some kind of debate in industry about what level of uncertainty there might be around these things, and I think that might help to bring them back. As for the regulation and the wording around it, I agree. I think it could go on and on and on. I heard today someone talking about aspirational exploration targets versus pre-production exploration targets. We've got to be really careful, I think. And, it probably differs by commodity. I think the iron ore and the coal industry might be driving a lot of that, and maybe we should get some input from them specifically on where those things can be constrained. I'm sure others have got views on it. I think it's a big topic, particularly in this audience.
Anyone else want to have a say, or is that it?
Perhaps I could just add, I've always liked the aspect of the JORC Code that relies on the competent person to make, who is competent with a capital C, and perhaps competent by Jackie's measure as well, to make those statements that people can rely on based on the fact that he or she is competent to do that. And I think it would be a terrible day if we started to try and define in words every aspect of what an exploration target is. You move into a different commodity or a different geological environment, you then have to change the rules again to define what an exploration target is. So I think while there will always be some grey areas around the edges, I think relying on the competency of our competent persons who are going to make those statements about exploration targets is where we have to be.
But I think there are a lot of grey areas, and even amongst competent persons, I would imagine there'd be quite a bit of debate about, what level of uncertainty is associated with that. What's an appropriate range of tonnes and grades? Is 0 to a very large number is not appropriate. Is there any sort of common industry practice? Like, I think debating some of these things between competent persons could help define. I agree, you could keep creating more and more clauses and things in JORC which won't be helpful.
I think Chris Cairns has got some words.
Is this on? Yeah, I just want to make one clarification. Aspirational targets weren't dealt with in the JORC Code. In effect, an aspirational target is saying we want to be a 500,000 ounce per annum producer, something like that. It's not saying, look, we want to have a resource inventory of 10 million tonnes at 2 grams. That's not an aspirational target in the context of the way we constructed the code. So if you want to use an exploration target, it needs to be in the context of a range, so 8 to 12 million tonnes at 1.7 to 2.3 grams is fine for an exploration target, but aspirational targets are more corporate statements. They're not technical statements.
I completely agree, but I just think that word is creeping into the discussion, and
Well, let's snuff that
let's
out.
try and. But I do think JORC's stating that it can be based on a proposed program or actual results. That for me is a slight shift in the concept of an exploration target, or I think.
I can give you some background on that too. The discussion was along the lines of, okay, you've got, you're an iron ore explorer, you've got aeromagnetics in the Pilbara, you can see this large magnetic feature. The guy on the other side of the tenement boundary has drilled an iron ore deposits out, and you can follow that feature through into your deposit, and you're saying, look, based on what we know of the dimensions of the target, et cetera, we can hang some numbers off that. So that's our exploration target. And now you're required to say, look, we're going out there in February with a drill rig, and we're going to drill X number of holes, and we'll test it. So you need to have, it's a hypothesis that is testable. Whereas you can, likewise, in a mining environment, say that you're mining high grade underground at depth, you've got some actual results to support an aspiration, or not an exploration target within an operation. So by extension, you expect that the ore body will continue, and so you within as an extension to your existing resources, you can have an exploration target in that context as well. And so hence, is it conceptual, or is it an extrapolation or an expectation that existing results will continue at depth, for example?
So perhaps that's a way the industry could go, in saying only if it's extrapolated from something known, rather than it being completely.
Yeah, look, I think it just has to come down to the reasonable test, and reasonable, means that you've got some type of support for that range, and I agree, bulks are more easily backed up, particularly in an area like the Pilbara or somewhere else. But doing it for base metals or for gold, precious metals, etc., a lot harder. And I think if you want to get to an exploration target on those things, you've got to start having some quantitative measure that you've rather than just you've got a geophysical target, you've actually gone and done some type of sampling where you know the mineralisation style or the minerals present, and really that comes down again to the section 1 and section 2 of reporting your exploration results, and if not, why not?
Okay, well, I'm sure there's going to be more on that later on. The next issue, and I think it has particular relevance for most people sitting in this room, and that's the competent person form. I know that signing that form, saying that you've agreed to the content of the report and the form and manner in which it's expressed, at times can be a career-limiting move in some companies. So it's all right to have a form, is what I'm saying, but how do people feel, and it may be something that can be taken up in the questions later, how much pressure goes on to a competent person, particularly in a time like this where many companies, I guess, are trying to raise very scarce investor cash at the moment, and they're under a great deal of pressure. It could be also consultants, but I'm more particularly thinking of employees of a company to in fact embellish, or at least to sign off that something which has gone to the board, which might have been quite a good report from a competent person, has then turned into a much more promotional document. How do we deal with that, particularly in the current environment?
Yeah, it's not very easy. It's I've always tried to find the form and context which it states off the release before I give a competent person statement to go with it. I've had many cases where people want the consent form, and I haven't actually seen what they've written yet. and it's just quite easy to say, well, I need to read it before I can give you what is a competent person statement to sign off on it. So it's always read it first before you say it's okay.
Yeah, if I can duck in there, sorry, John Hearn from Coffee. Look, this consent form's going the same way as the 43-101 consent form. Once you've signed off, you're liable for life. So you all need to understand that that's what you're making the consultant do, and usually he's not going to be very happy with it unless he's quite clear that his opinion's put forward and he's happy with the report. And it goes back to the previous question, the exploration results. Most of the problems aren't on this table, they're out there somewhere. You all know the arsehole who's written off a bit of moose pasture as an exploration target and sold it and floated it. We're all nodding our heads. It's not up to us to maintain what becomes an exploration target, what doesn't. It's up to you blokes. So that goes for the consent. The consultants have their minimum levels of requirement. There is within most of the consultants on this table, there's quite a rigorous mentoring and peer review process before a report goes out, and Table 1 just confirms that, I guess, is effectively documenting what we do internally, and that becomes public information. So signing off on this consent form, as long as Table 1 is filled in completely, should hold no problems to someone who's done the report properly. And I guess that's a question to you lot out there, because we're pretty sure we do it okay. Not pushing that. Look, being a consultant, this is all a pain in the arse too. Don't think it's going to be a pot of gold for all of us. That you people out there have to be sure that your competent people are competent and happy with what they're signing off and are prepared to stand up in front of a team of peers and explain their signature and consent.
I'd add the same thing. From a consulting point of view, that's what you do. You do it day in, day out, and the work comes in, and you become quite clinical about the way that you approach things. This needs to be done, this needs to be done, I've got to be able to see it and so on. But I do see a lot of it just anecdotally in industry where it's not something that people do every day, and stuff comes up, and yeah, people can be put under pressure. But the bottom line is that he or she needs to be able to say, well, yes, that's appropriate, or no, that's not, or we have to do something else.
Well, I might contend that you who have multiple clients can do that. I'm talking about some people that may be employees and that's their only source of income, and particularly in the current environment where jobs are somewhat hard to get, maybe a little bit easier to hold on to, but hard to get if you end up unemployed. How do they go around it? It takes an awful lot of guts, I suggest to people in this room, to stand up to a board and say, no, that's not the way I intended it to be written.
Well, the instances I've thought of, that is essentially what's happened, and quite often what's happened is once they've found somebody else who is prepared to toe the line, they lose their job, absolutely.
That's right. I'll leave that one with you. I guess moving up the food chain a little bit to reserves. All of us noted, I think, some months ago when the gold price dropped, and I was waiting for a whole stack of announcements pretty quickly after that from companies that had reserves, saying, well, we're not yet sons of Gwalia, but we're not far off it. I didn't see them. Perhaps I should have. I don't know. There was some laughs down here from the ASIC and ASX corner. Perhaps I can ask one of them to move to the microphone and answer that one. It wasn't me laughing, but I knew I was going to have to answer the question. The old JORC Code, 2004, required you to report, clause 13 or 14 required you to report annually on your reserve estimates. And this issue arose long before we started on this review process, and we asked the question of JORC, what do we do in this circumstance, and should we be looking for these types of announcements? And the response, which was JORC's response, and I think it's right, is that it depends on the long-term view of the assumptions which people have based their reserve on. So if there's depends on where they are in relation to the assumptions, and it depends on what they think is going to happen to the gold price or whatever the price is in the short term. Short term can get slightly longer,
But that was the position put by JORC, and I think that's still the right position.
Of course, commercially, the banks, particularly, are the ones that watch for that, and probably are the ones quietly asking the company if their reserves are still there. Okay. I guess another one that's probably a fairly easy one for the panel and others to announce. I've seen some quite good examples lately of announcements, frankly, being made in quarterlies and annual reports and even conference presentations. Has anyone else seen this trend, particularly in quarterlies, which concerns me, of making announcements that haven't previously been made in a formal announcement to the ASX? James is going to answer that one.
Obviously, you all know we have a continuous disclosure rule which applies as the primary rule of all listed companies. So, you know, if you're aware of material information, you've got to disclose it. We obviously are very concerned if we see new information, new material information being disclosed for the first time in a quarterly or any of the other periodic report, the annual, what have you. There have been a couple of instances where we have seen that, and you know, obviously we make inquiries because, you know, it would seem obvious to us that if you're announcing it the first time in your quarterly, you may have been aware of it for some time. Or at least you hadn't complied with the continuous disclosure obligation. As a general rule, the inquiries come back and say, look, we became aware of it at the time of the release of the report, so we put it in the report. We don't think that's the best practice. We think if you become aware of something and it's new and material, then you should do it by way of a separate announcement. We don't want to see in annual reports or quarterlies all the information in Table 1. We think that should be a standalone announcement. That's the view. And sorry, Rick, while I'm here and have the microphone, just in relation to your point about the competent person, the competent person feeling pressured to sign something, you know, if an employer asks a competent person to commit fraud, to steal something, they're not going to do it. So why would you put out a misleading, sign off on potentially a misleading announcement when to do so would actually be a criminal offence? Because if you make a statement which is misleading of the market operator, ASX, then that's actually a criminal offence. And there's other criminal offences in the corporations law which go with that, the 1041s. So, you know, being pressured into doing it does not justify committing a criminal offence.
And what's your advice, though, if that does the competent person?
Well, dare I say, they're probably procuring you to commit a criminal offence with a criminal offence in itself. Yeah.
But what's your advice to people in this room? Do they come to you guys or their professional body?
Professional body and us, of course, but ASIC is actually the regulator for the misleading deceptive statements.
Rick.
Chris? Yeah.
Yes, sorry I just want to clarify with PowerPoint presentations, given that I was involved in quite a protracted discussion as to whether a PowerPoint presentation was in fact a public report or whether it was a summary report as defined by the 2004 Code. And I won't go into the technical details, but the upshot of it was, and my contention was, that a PowerPoint presentation could not be a public report because it couldn't properly deal with all the Table 1 issues that needed to be dealt with every aspect contained within the presentation, which may include exploration results, mineral resources, and ore reserves, and you'd have this massive document if it was to properly comply. So the way that's been dealt with in the 2012 report is this ability to use the competent person's sign-off or consent from a previous properly constructed public report. It's been released to the exchange with all of the appropriate Table 1 commentary associated with it, and then that consent is then grandfathered, if you will, into the presentation. But the presentation summarising those results, if you will, needs to reference the appropriately constructed public report that's previously been released. So the upshot, no new results in presentation format.
Okay, I'd just like to make a sort of almost a pulpit statement concerning the complaints procedures of both AIG and the Institute of Mining Metallurgy, which I guess I can't ask myself a question, but it came up in Jackie's presentation when she talked about, I guess, reactions to the imposition of potentially of sanctions, and she said there were 4 strategies that were being used by people if they wanted to sort of go around or try and confront complaints procedures by the Institute of Mining Metallurgy and AIG. And they were institute switching, I think was one of them, and I've seen some excellent examples of that one. Legal liability of either the people that are involved on complaints committees, like myself or others that are involved in that process, and of course our parent bodies. And speaking from AIG's perspective, we have roughly 800,000 in net assets. Now I've heard someone say 15,000 a day for a QC, and his team. You can burn up $800,000 of our net assets extremely quickly if someone gets litigious, if there's a complaint made against them. The confidentiality, to some extent, was another one that Jackie mentioned. The AIG complaints procedure allows for, I guess, a fair bit of the complaints process, particularly as it relates to JORC or VALMIN, is fairly confidential to a certain level. Clearly, if you're a serial offender, or alternatively, we can see intent, and I'll come back to intent in a moment. We largely keep it as mentoring of the individuals concerned. And the other thing is time taken. And I have a day job. I have my wife reckons I've got things to do around the house, etc., and some kids. It all takes up time, and all this has got to be done largely outside of work time, outside of family time, etc., and it does take a while. The ASX and to some extent ASIC are the immediate responders if there's issues, but the complaints procedure from the Institute of Mining Metallurgy and AIG takes a fair bit longer to do. There's natural justice in there as well. Some of the issues we've heard of around exploration targets, which I have to admit tends to be one of the common things, there's a lot of grey in those areas. Exploration results as well, there's a fair bit of grey, and that's where most of the complaints seem to come from. Resources, higher level resources and reserves, not many complaints about those. Maybe some of the practitioners here involved in that can talk a bit more about those. The other issue is intent. The complaints, the AIG complaints procedure, in terms of sanctions, I guess, separates out what is clearly what I would call laziness, incompetence, lack of due care and attention, that sort of stuff, from intent, where someone has deliberately attempted to breach either particularly materiality and transparency. Most of the time it's just sloppiness, bad writing, dog ate my homework type stuff, rather than someone deliberate. It's very hard to prove intent in some cases, and that puts a lot of pressure back on the complaints processes of the two organisations. So it does take a while. I don't really apologise about that too much. The confidentiality, I think, is appropriate, given that people's employment and so on is often impacted by this, unless there was intent or they were a serial performer. And I've got several people that are now on a very short leash, that if they offend again, even if it is laziness, incompetence, whatever, and they haven't done anything about it, almost speaks for intent later on. If you haven't done something to improve your laziness or whatever, eventually you can get named. I guess the question I have is there any way that we could improve some of these elements of this, and particularly the time taken? Is there any way that we could improve that?
Could I answer again? Look, I would throw the question back out to the ASX and say, when are you going to put a geologist on the team? Because you talk about one of the ways of employing geologists at the moment. It's a good thing. But the TMX have got a team of 3. I mean, I think they've got 1,600 mining companies listed.
Only that few.
Yeah, that few. I think you've got, 800 or?
No, it goes like this. In the last 2 years, my team has taken on just over 1,100 JORC type issues. I'm not sure how many other parties involved in this space have taken on, but certainly we've taken on the lion's share, and we've done that without having a geologist on board. So our numbers speak for themselves in terms of the issues we're identifying and taking on board. The issue we have now, though, is, and it's not a question of whether or not we need a geologist in our ranks. If you look at the structure of the new reporting regime, under the 2004 code, it was very, very difficult to have peer review or peer review of substance, because you didn't know what people were basing it on. Now you have a regime where you've got Table 1. People actually have to disclose information, put information out there so that daylight is the great sanitizer, and be exposed. We expect that will introduce much greater discipline to the reporting, because people will have to actually put their basis and reasoning in the Table 1. So we think that'll introduce a much greater level of discipline. And secondly, we think it will up the level of peer review. You need to remember, though, ASX doesn't regulate competent persons. We regulate the companies. So in terms of taking on the companies, our numbers speak for themselves. We have looked at the idea of having a geologist on board. We went to the market last year, but 2 years ago, but there was a
go again now, mate. Yeah. I think you'll get a few more applicants.
Something about the taxi driver on the way here. So how it works now, though, is that we don't have a geologist on board. What we do though is we use external consultants, and we've found that having going to just one person, they're limited in the scope of what they know. We find going to external consultants for the more egregious cases works better for us.
I guess quick one for you, James. How much pushback do you get from companies then when you approach them? We all see retractions and various other statements that follow in your announcements platform when you've clearly intervened. Some of those, I've been noticing it in the past, you used to put on the announcement page the letter that you actually sent to the company. Don't seem to be getting that anymore.
No, they were pretty much in rare circumstances and generally directed at 1 or 2 companies. So we won't go into great detail there. Obviously, there's pushback when it comes to retractions. People tend to think that they got it right the first time round. So we're seeing a lot of entities which say we're complying with, we're reporting under JORC Code 2012, and they're doing a pretty good effort at doing it, except they're leaving out the 8 matters they may need to disclose in the body of the announcement, or they're reporting parts of Table 1 on a they're saying not relevant. They're not saying why it's not relevant. So then it becomes a matter of, well, you need to get it right, and make the necessary disclosure. Not all announcements, though, need a retraction and restatement. Some of them, it may very well be that they've failed to properly describe a resource. They haven't put inferred, or it may be that they've done a contained metal and haven't put the tonnage and grade, the corresponding tonnage and grade, but they've previously done it. So the level of mischief isn't such that it warrants a complete retraction or a clarification. Depends on the circumstances. The big issues at the moment, though, are production targets. So you would have seen a number of production target type retractions. And obviously a lot of work goes into the companies, by the companies, in preparing a scoping study, them coming and preparing a production target on the back of that. But if they don't comply with the rule, they don't comply with the rule. If they don't have a basis for it, then they don't have a basis for it. You can't, despite all the money you may have spent in preparing the scoping study, if there is no basis for it, then you can't disclose it.
Chris?
Could I just make an observation or a question myself to you, James, not as a JORC member or more as an investor myself? So if a company has a 20-page announcement out with a 25 to 40 million ounce exploration target, and that's subsequently revised down to 2.5 to 4 million ounces, I would find it particularly useful if there was a cover page to say this is the primary change that has occurred, rather than have to flick through 40 pages of announcements side by side and compare where the change happened.
Chris, you as a sophisticated investor, well, I would be surprised that you're not reading every page. So,
right.
You know, if the information's there, the information's there. There's no prescription for that type of. But you will see in the actual listing rules themselves, there are other areas which are prescriptive in relation to resources reserves.
Okay, so I think where my question particularly heads to in that regard is that it's like law in any case where you have the legislation and then you have the case history that makes up the entire gamut of how the law will be applied. So currently we have the listing rules in the JORC Code. Really, I think what is absent in a visible sense to other practitioners is how that's being applied, and hence, if there were a summary of this is the transgression, this is why we pulled them up, and this has been the response, then it goes to the case history, and other practitioners in the industry see how the code and the listing rules are being applied, and it's very educational.
I mean, that is playing out in the production targets space. So there are a number of entities which have made